The clock on the restaurant wall showed 6:30 p.m. When Lucy walked through the staff entrance for another long Friday night shift. Her feet already hurt from working the lunch rush, but she couldn't afford to say no to the extra hours. Every dollar counted when you're trying to keep your head above water in a city like New York. Lucy had been working at Rosewood Restaurant for almost 3 years now. It wasn't the life she had planned, but sometimes life throws you curveballs that completely change your direction. She remembered walking through these same doors for the first time, desperate for any job that would pay the bills after her world fell apart. Rosewood was one of those fancy places where rich people came to eat overpriced food and show off their expensive clothes. The kind of restaurant where a single meal cost more than what Lucy made in a week. She had learned to smile and nod, to be invisible while being helpful, to never let her real thoughts show on her face. The restaurant was beautiful, she had to admit that. Dark wood panels covered the walls, crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and soft lighting made everything look warm and elegant. But the centerpiece of the whole place was the grand piano that sat right in the middle of the dining room. It was a gorgeous black Steinway that probably cost more than most people's cars. Lucy loved that piano, even though it was just decoration. The owner had bought it to make the place look classy, but nobody ever played it. Sometimes during quiet moments, Lucy would find herself staring at it, remembering a different time in her life when music was everything to her. She had been a music student once, believe it or not. For 6 years, she had studied at one of the best music schools in the country. Piano had been her life since she was 5 years old. Her parents had sacrificed everything to pay for her lessons, and she had practiced 4 hours every single day without fail. Getting into Juilliard had been like winning the lottery. Lucy still remembered the day she got her acceptance letter. She had cried tears of joy, knowing that all her hard work was finally paying off. She was going to be a professional pianist. She was going to perform in concert halls around the world. She was going to make her parents proud, but life has a way of crushing dreams when you least expect it. During her 3rd year at school, her father had a heart attack. The medical bills were enormous, and her family lost everything trying to save him. When he died 6 months later, Lucy had to make an impossible choice. She could either stay in school and watch her mother lose the family home, or she could drop out and get a job to help pay the bills. The choice was obvious, even though it broke her heart. She left Juilliard and never looked back. Well, that wasn't entirely true. She looked back every single day, but she tried not to let it show. Working at Rosewood was steady work, and the tips were decent when she got the right tables. Most of the customers were polite enough, though some treated the staff like they were invisible. Lucy had learned to deal with all types of people, from the lonely businessman who came in every Tuesday to the celebrity who insisted on sitting at the same table every time. The hardest part wasn't the rude customers or the long hours or even the fact that her feet hurt every single night. The hardest part was walking past that piano every day and pretending it didn't matter to her. Sometimes she would catch herself humming while she worked, and she would have to stop herself before anyone noticed. Her coworkers were nice enough, but they didn't really understand her. How could they? They saw her as just another waitress trying to make ends meet. They didn't know about her past, about the years of training, about the dreams she had given up. She preferred it that way. It was easier than explaining why someone with her background was serving tables instead of performing on stage. Lucy had gotten pretty good at reading people over the years. She could tell within 5 minutes whether a customer was going to be nice or difficult, whether they were celebrating something special or having the worst day of their lives. She had learned to adjust her approach accordingly, to give each table exactly what they needed to have a good experience. Tonight felt different somehow, though she couldn't put her finger on why. Maybe it was the way the manager had been nervous all afternoon, or maybe it was the fact that they had a reservation for a party of 8 that nobody wanted to talk about. In a place like Rosewood, big parties usually meant big tips, so it was strange that none of the other servers seemed excited about it. As Lucy tied her apron and checked her appearance in the staff mirror, she noticed that the piano looked extra shiny tonight. Someone had obviously spent time polishing it until it gleamed under the restaurant lights. It looked beautiful, like it was waiting for someone special to come along and bring it to life. She shook her head and pushed the thought away. That piano wasn't for people like her anymore. It was just decoration, a pretty piece of furniture that rich people could admire while they ate their expensive dinners. She was a waitress now, and that was okay. She was helping her mother keep the house, and that was what mattered. The evening started like any other. Lucy served her regular customers, took orders, delivered food, and collected tips. She was good at her job, efficient and friendly without being pushy. She had learned that the secret to good service was paying attention to what people needed before they even knew they needed it. But as the clock moved toward 8:30, she noticed that the manager was getting more and more anxious. He kept checking his watch and looking toward the door like he was expecting someone important. Lucy had seen this behavior before. Usually when food critics or local celebrities made reservations, then the door opened and she understood why everyone was nervous. The man who walked in was someone she recognized from magazines and news articles. He was one of those tech billionaires who seemed to be in the papers every week, either for making another fortune or for saying something controversial. He was younger than she had expected, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about money. He wasn't alone. Behind him came a group of people who all looked like they belonged in the same world. He did. Expensive suits, expensive watches, expensive smiles that never quite reached their eyes. They moved through the restaurant like they owned the place, which for all Lucy knew, maybe they did. The manager practically ran over to greet them, his nervous energy now making perfect sense. This was clearly a very important table, the kind that could make or break a restaurant's reputation. Lucy watched from across the room as they were seated at the best table in the house, right next to the piano. She couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to have that kind of power. To walk into any room and have people immediately start trying to impress you. It seemed lonely, in a way, never knowing if people liked you for who you were, or just for what you could do for them. As Lucy continued working her other tables, she kept glancing over at the important party. Something about them made her uncomfortable, though she couldn't quite say what it was. Maybe it was the way they laughed a little too loudly at jokes that weren't very funny, or the way they seemed to be looking around the room like they were judging everything they saw. She had no idea that before the night was over, her life was about to change in ways she never could have imagined. Lucy tried to stay focused on her other tables, but she couldn't help stealing glances at the wealthy businessman and his group. They had been there for almost 2 hours now, and their conversation was getting louder with each round of drinks. The man everyone seemed to revolve around was clearly enjoying being the center of attention. When the manager approached her with a nervous smile, Lucy knew what was coming. "Lucy, I need you to take over table 12, he said quietly. "Jennifer called in sick, and they specifically requested our best server." Lucy nodded, though she wasn't sure if being called the best server was a compliment or just meant she was the one most likely to put up with difficult customers without causing problems. As she walked toward their table, Lucy could hear snippets of their conversation. They were talking about business deals worth millions of dollars like most people talked about grocery shopping. The businessman was telling a story about buying a company just to fire the CEO who had disagreed with him at a conference. His friends were laughing like it was the funniest thing they'd ever heard. "Good evening," Lucy said with her practiced smile as she approached their table. "I'm Lucy, and I'll be taking care of you for the rest of the evening. Can I get anyone another drink?" The businessman looked up at her with eyes that seemed to be evaluating everything about her. It wasn't the kind of look that made her uncomfortable in a creepy way, but more like he was trying to figure out how much she was worth and whether she was worthy of his attention. "Well, well," he said with a smirk. "Finally, someone who looks like she knows what she's doing. The last girl seemed scared of us." His friends chuckled, and Lucy forced her smile to stay in place. She had dealt with customers like this before, people who thought money gave them the right to say whatever they wanted. "I'll do my best to take good care of everyone," Lucy replied professionally. Would you like to see our dessert menu, or can I bring you another round of drinks? For the next 30 minutes, Lucy did her job perfectly. She brought them drinks, cleared their plates, and answered their questions about the menu. She was polite but not overly friendly, efficient but not rushed. It was a balancing act she had mastered over the years, but she noticed the businessman watching her more than was normal. Every time she came to the table, his eyes followed her. When she was serving other customers, she could feel him looking in her direction. It made her slightly uncomfortable, but she tried to ignore it. The turning point came when she was clearing their dessert plates. She had been stealing quick glances at the piano all evening, something she did without even thinking about it. It was like a habit she couldn't break, looking at that beautiful instrument that never got played. You keep looking at that piano, the businessman said suddenly, his voice cutting through the restaurant's ambient noise. Do you play? Lucy's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't realized she was being so obvious. Oh, no, sir, she lied smoothly. I was just admiring it. It's a beautiful instrument. But the businessman wasn't buying it. He leaned back in his chair with a knowing smile. I don't think that's true. I've been watching you all night, and every few minutes, your eyes go straight to that piano. Nobody looks at an instrument like that unless they play. His friends were starting to pay attention now, sensing that their leader was onto something. Interesting. Lucy felt her cheeks getting warm. Really, sir, I don't play. I was just thinking how nice it must be to know how. The businessman's smile grew wider. You're lying, he said, loud enough that people at nearby tables started to look over. I can always tell when people are lying to me. It's how I made my fortune. Lucy tried to change the subject. Can I get you anything else this evening? Perhaps. Some coffee? But the businessman was having too much fun to let it go. He stood up from his chair, and Lucy noticed that he was a little unsteady on his feet. He had definitely had too much wine. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced to the entire restaurant, his voice carrying across the room, I think we have a mystery on our hands. The restaurant started to quiet down as people turned to see what was happening. Lucy felt her stomach drop. This was exactly the kind of attention she never wanted. Our lovely waitress here has been staring at that piano all night like she's in love with it. The businessman continued, clearly enjoying the audience, but she claims she doesn't play. What do you think, folks? Should we find out if she's telling the truth? A few people chuckled nervously, but most of the restaurant was just watching with the kind of uncomfortable fascination that comes when you see someone making a scene in public. Lucy wanted to disappear into the floor. Sir, please, she said. Quietly, I really need to get back to work. But the businessman was just getting started. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet, making a big show of counting out bills. I'll tell you what, he said, his voice getting louder. I'm feeling generous tonight. I just closed a deal that made me richer than most people can even imagine. He held up a handful of cash. $500, he announced. $500 if you can sit down at that piano and play something that doesn't sound like a dying cat. The restaurant was completely quiet now. Even the servers had stopped moving. Lucy could feel dozens of eyes on her, and she wanted nothing more than to run away. But $500 was more than she made in a week. It was enough to catch up on her rent and maybe even send some extra money to her mother. I really can't, Lucy said, her voice barely above a whisper. The businessman's expression changed. The playful mockery was replaced by something colder, more calculating. Oh, but that's not all, he said with a cruel smile. See, I don't think you're just any waitress. I think you're someone who used to be something more, and now you're trying to hide it. Lucy felt like he could see right through her, like he knew exactly what buttons to push. I don't know what you mean, she said. I think you do, he replied. And I think you're scared. Scared that you'll sit down at that piano and everyone will see that you're not as good as you used to be. Scared that you'll embarrass yourself in front of all these people. His words hit her like a physical blow. How could he possibly know? How could a stranger see the fear that she had been carrying for 3 years? But here's the thing, the businessman continued, his voice now loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear. If you can't play, if you're just a waitress who's been lying to us all night, then I want you to admit it. Right here, in front of everyone." He paused dramatically, letting his words sink in. "I want you to tell everyone that you're just a waitress who doesn't know her place. That you've been putting on airs all night, pretending to be something you're not." The silence in the restaurant was deafening. Lucy could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She looked around at all the faces staring at her, some sympathetic, others just curious, and a few that seemed to be enjoying the show. She thought about her rent, due in 3 days. She thought about her mother, struggling to keep the house. She thought about all the dreams she had given up and all the sacrifices she had made. And she thought about that piano, sitting there silent and beautiful, waiting for someone to bring it to life. The businessman was still holding the money, waving it slightly like he was dangling bait in front of a fish. His friends were grinning, clearly enjoying watching him humiliate someone they saw as beneath them. The whole restaurant was holding its breath, waiting to see what she would do. Lucy looked at the piano one more time, and for just a moment, she could almost hear the music that used to flow through her fingers. She could almost remember what it felt like to lose herself in the beauty of a perfect melody, to feel the power of creating something magical with just her hands and her heart. But that was a long time ago. That was a different person in a different life. Now she was just Lucy the waitress, and maybe it was time to stop pretending to be anything else. She took a deep breath and walked toward the piano, her legs feeling like they were made of lead. Behind her, she could hear the businessman's triumphant laugh, and she wondered if she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. Lucy's legs felt shaky as she walked across the restaurant floor toward the piano. Every step seemed to take forever, and she could feel the weight of everyone's stares following her movement. The distance between the businessman's table and the piano couldn't have been more than 20 feet, but it felt like she was walking across an entire football field. Her hands were trembling now, and she tried to hide it by clasping them together in front of her. The last time she had performed in front of people was over 3 years ago, during her final recital at school before everything fell apart. Back then she had been confident, prepared, excited even. Now she felt like she might throw up. The piano bench looked smaller than she remembered. When she was a student, piano benches had always felt like thrones to her, places where she could sit and command an entire room with just her fingertips. Tonight, this bench felt more like a witness. Stand where she was about to be judged by a jury of strangers, she sat down slowly, trying to buy herself a few more seconds to think. The businessman and his friends were still talking loudly behind her, making jokes about what they expected to hear. "I bet she plays Happy Birthday," one of them said, causing the others to burst into laughter. "Maybe she knows Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star," another added. Lucy tried to block out their voices and focus on the instrument in front of her. The piano was even more beautiful up close. The black surface was so polished she could see her own reflection staring back at her. The keys were pristine white and black, perfectly aligned and waiting for someone to press them. She placed her hands gently on the keys without pressing down, just feeling their familiar texture under her fingertips. It had been so long since she had touched a real piano. She had a small keyboard in her tiny apartment, but it wasn't the same. This was a real Steinway, the kind of instrument she used to dream about owning someday. For a moment, muscle memory took over. Her hands automatically found the correct position. Her fingers curved in the way she had been taught since childhood. Her posture straightened as she felt her breathing become deeper and more controlled. It was like her body remembered how to be a pianist even though her mind was terrified. The restaurant had become completely silent now. Even the kitchen staff had stopped what they were doing to watch. Lucy could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, and she was pretty sure everyone else could hear it too. She closed her eyes and tried to remember what her old piano teacher used to tell her. "Don't think about the audience," Professor Williams had always said. "Don't think about the mistakes you might make. Just think about the music. Let the music tell its story through you." But what music should she play? She had been put on the spot with no time to prepare, no sheet music to read from. She needed to pick something she knew by heart, something she had played so many times that her fingers could find the notes even in her sleep. Several options ran through her mind. She could play something simple and safe, maybe a basic classical piece that would satisfy the bet without revealing too much about her real abilities. That would be the smart choice, the safe choice. She could collect her $500 and go back to being invisible, but then she thought about the businessman's cruel words, about how he had tried to humiliate her in front of everyone. She thought about all the times over the past 3 years when people had looked down on her because she was just a waitress. She thought about all the dreams she had given up and all the music that had been trapped inside her with no way to escape. A fire started burning in her chest. A feeling she hadn't experienced in years. It was the same feeling she used to get right before a big performance, when nervous energy transformed into something powerful and electric. She realized that she wasn't just scared anymore. She was angry, if she was going to do this. If she was going to expose herself in front of all these people, then she wasn't going to hold back. She was going to show them exactly who she really was. Lucy opened her eyes and positioned her hands over the keys. She had made her decision. She was going to play Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, one of the most challenging pieces in all of classical music. It was a piece that took years to master, a piece that only serious pianists even attempted to learn. She took one deep breath, and then she began to play. The first notes were soft and haunting, like a whisper in the darkness. Lucy's left hand established the gentle melody while her right hand added delicate harmonies above it. The opening of this piece was deceptively simple, but Lucy knew that was about to change dramatically. The businessman's laughter died immediately. The smirk disappeared from his face as he realized that what he was hearing was not the amateur fumbling he had expected. This was real music, played by someone who clearly knew what they were doing. As the piece progressed, Lucy felt something magical happening. The fear that had been paralyzing her just moments before was melting away, replaced by the pure joy of making music again. Her fingers found their rhythm, her muscle memory kicked in fully, and suddenly she wasn't a nervous waitress anymore. She was a pianist. The melody began to build in intensity, and Lucy's hands moved across the keys with increasing confidence. The gentle opening theme gave way to more complex passages, rapid runs of notes that cascaded like water falling down. A mountain. Her left hand played powerful bass notes that seemed to shake the very foundations of the restaurant, while her right hand danced through intricate melodies that told a story of passion and heartbreak. People in the restaurant began to lean forward in their seats. Conversations that had been quietly continuing despite the performance stopped entirely. Servers who had been moving between tables froze in place, their trays forgotten in their hands. Even the businessman's friends had stopped talking and were staring at Lucy. With expressions of complete shock, Lucy was lost in the music now, completely absorbed in the story the piece was telling. Chopin had written this ballade to express some of his deepest emotions, and Lucy poured her own heart into every note. 3 years of suppressed feelings, 3 years of missed opportunities and abandoned dreams, all came flowing out through her fingertips. The middle section of the piece was where the real fireworks began. Lucy's hands flew across the keyboard in a display of technical skill that left no doubt about her training and abilities. Complex chord progressions that would challenge even professional pianists flowed effortlessly from her fingers. The dynamic range of her playing was breathtaking, moving from whisper-soft passages to thunderous climaxes that filled every corner of the restaurant. A woman at a table near the window had tears streaming down her face. She recognized the piece and understood the incredible skill required to play it at this level. An elderly man who had been a classical music lover his entire life was shaking his head in amazement, unable to believe what he was witnessing in a restaurant of all places. The businessman was no longer smiling. His face had gone pale, and he was gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were white. He was beginning to realize that he had made a terrible mistake, that he had tried to humiliate someone who was far more talented than he had ever. Imagine. As Lucy moved into the final section of the piece, her playing became even more intense and emotional. This was the climax that Chopin had built toward throughout the entire ballade, and Lucy delivered it with a power and passion that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her soul. The music swelled and crashed like ocean waves, filling the restaurant, with sounds so beautiful that it seemed almost impossible that it was coming from just one person and one instrument. The technical demands of the piece were enormous, but Lucy met every challenge with confidence and grace. Her years of training at one of the world's best music schools were evident in every phrase, every perfectly executed run, every emotionally charged chord. This wasn't just good playing. This was the kind of performance that people remember for the rest of their lives, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, the piece came to an end. The final notes hung in the air like a prayer, soft and beautiful and absolutely perfect. Lucy's hands remained poised over the keys for a moment, as if she couldn't quite believe that it was over. The silence that followed was unlike anything any of them had ever experienced. It wasn't the awkward silence of people not knowing how to react. It was the reverent silence of people who had just witnessed something truly extraordinary and needed a moment to process what they had heard. Lucy slowly lowered her hands to her lap and turned around on the piano bench to face the restaurant. What she saw took her breath away. Every single person in the place was staring at her with expressions of awe and amazement. And then, as if someone had given a signal, the entire restaurant erupted into the most thunderous applause she had ever heard. The applause seemed to go on forever. Lucy sat on the piano bench, completely overwhelmed by the response from the crowd. She had expected maybe some polite clapping, the kind of reaction you get when someone does something mildly impressive at a dinner party, but this was different. This was the kind of applause she remembered from her student days. When audiences were genuinely moved by what they had heard, people were standing up now, giving her a full standing ovation. The woman, who had been crying during the performance, was wiping her eyes with her napkin, still clapping enthusiastically. The elderly man near the window was nodding his head with approval and saying something to his wife that Lucy couldn't hear over the noise, but the most dramatic change was in the businessman and his group. The man who had been so confident and mocking just minutes before now looked like he had seen a ghost. His mouth was hanging open slightly, and his hands were frozen in mid-clap, as if he couldn't quite process what had just happened. His friends weren't laughing anymore either. They were all staring at Lucy with expressions that ranged from shock to embarrassment. As the applause finally began to die down, Lucy stood up from the piano bench on shaky legs. She felt like she was in a dream, like none of this could possibly be real. 3 years of hiding who she really was, 3 years of pretending that music didn't matter to her anymore. And now suddenly her secret was out for everyone to see. She started to walk back toward the businessman's table, not really sure what to expect. Would he honor his bet? Would he try to find some excuse not to pay her? She had dealt with enough difficult customers over the years to know that some people would rather argue than admit they were wrong, but before she could take more than a few steps, someone else stood up. It was the elderly man who had been sitting near the window, and Lucy noticed for the first time that he was impeccably dressed in a way that suggested he was someone important. He was probably in his 70s, with silver hair and kind eyes that seemed to sparkle with intelligence. "Excuse me, young lady," he said in a voice that carried clearly across the restaurant. "That was absolutely extraordinary. I don't think I've heard Chopin's first ballade played with such skill and emotion in many years." Lucy felt her cheeks getting red again, but this time it was from embarrassment at the praise rather than humiliation. "Thank you, sir," she said quietly. "That's very kind of you to say." The man smiled and walked toward her, and Lucy noticed that other people in the restaurant were watching this interaction with great interest. There was something about the way he carried himself that suggested he was someone who knew what he was talking about when it came to music. "Tell me," he continued, "where did you study? That level of technical proficiency doesn't happen by accident." "You've clearly had serious classical training," Lucy hesitated. She wasn't used to talking about her background anymore. For 3 years, she had avoided any conversation that might lead to questions about her past. But something about this man's Genuine interest made her want to answer honestly. I studied at Juilliard, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, for about 3 years before I had to leave. The man's eyebrows raised in surprise. Juilliard? That's one of the finest music schools in the world. May I ask who your piano instructor was? Professor Williams, Lucy replied. Elizabeth Williams. The man's face lit up with recognition. Elizabeth Williams? Betty Williams? Oh my goodness, I know her well. We've been friends for over 20 years. She's one of the most respected piano teachers in the country. Lucy nodded, feeling a mixture of pride and sadness at hearing her old teacher's name. Professor Williams had been like a mother to her during her time at school, and leaving without saying goodbye properly had been one of the hardest parts of dropping out. You know, the man continued, Betty used to talk about a student she had. Someone with exceptional talent who had to leave school due to family circumstances. She never mentioned the student's name, but she always said it was one of the greatest tragedies she had witnessed in her teaching career. She said this student had the kind of natural ability that comes along once in a generation. Lucy felt tears starting to form in her eyes. She had always wondered if Professor Williams had thought about her after she left, or if she had just been another student who didn't make it to graduation. That was you, wasn't it? The man asked gently. You're the student she never stopped talking about. Lucy could only nod. She didn't trust her voice to work properly at the moment. The man reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. My name is Jonathan Hayes, he said, handing her the card. I'm a classical music critic for several major publications, and I also help coordinate auditions for some of the country's top orchestras. Lucy looked down at the card in her hands. The name was familiar to her now that she heard it. Jonathan Hayes was one of the most respected music critics in the country. His reviews could make or break a musician's career, and his recommendations carried enormous weight in the classical music world. What I just heard, he continued, was not the playing of someone who used to be good at piano. That was the playing of someone who is still at the top of their game, despite being away from formal training. Your technique is flawless, your musicality is extraordinary, and your emotional connection to the music is something that can't be taught. Lucy was having trouble processing what she was hearing. For 3 years, she had convinced herself that her musical abilities were probably rusty, but she had lost the skills that had once made her special. She had been afraid to even try playing seriously again because she was terrified of discovering that she wasn't as good as she used to be. There's something else, Jonathan said, lowering his voice so that only Lucy could hear. The New York Philharmonic is currently looking for a guest soloist for their upcoming season. Their original choice had to cancel due to illness, and they're having trouble finding a replacement at such short notice. Lucy's heart started beating faster. The New York Philharmonic was one of the most prestigious orchestras in the world. Playing with them had always been one of her biggest dreams, something she had hoped to do someday after graduating and building her career. I know the music director personally, Jonathan continued. If you're interested, I could arrange for you to audition. Based on what I heard tonight, I think you would have a very good chance of getting the position. Lucy felt like the room was spinning. This couldn't be happening. Things like this didn't happen to waitresses who had given up their dreams 3 years ago. This was the kind of opportunity that she had thought was lost to her forever. I don't know what to say, she managed to get out. You don't have to say anything right now, Jonathan replied with a kind smile. Think about it, but don't think too long. The audition would need to happen within the next few weeks. During this entire conversation, the businessman had been standing nearby, clearly listening to every word. Lucy had almost forgotten about him in the excitement of meeting Jonathan Hayes, but now she turned to see him approaching with a very different expression than he had worn earlier in the evening. The confident smirk was completely gone, replaced by something that looked almost like shame. He was holding the money he had promised her, but he wasn't waving it around triumphantly anymore. Instead, he seemed to be holding it carefully, like it was something precious. I owe you an apology, he said quietly, his voice lacking all of the arrogance it had carried before. And I owe you this money, though I know it doesn't begin to make up for how I treated you tonight." He held out not just the $500 he had promised, but what looked like much more. Lucy could see several more bills in his hand, though she couldn't tell exactly how much it was. "I was wrong about you," he continued. "I was wrong about a lot of things, actually. I thought I was being clever, but I was just being cruel to someone who didn't deserve it. Someone who is clearly far more talented and accomplished than I ever realized." Lucy took the money, still not quite believing. This was really happening. She looked down and saw that he had given her not $500 but $5,000. Her hands started shaking as she realized what this meant for her immediate financial situation. "You don't have to give me this much," she said. "Yes, I do," he replied firmly. "Consider it an investment in your future. Use it to get back to doing what you're clearly meant to be doing." As Lucy stood there holding more money than she had seen in years, with a potential audition opportunity that could change her entire life, she realized that her world had just been turned completely upside down. In the span of one evening, she had gone from being a struggling waitress trying to hide her past to being offered a chance to reclaim the future she thought she had lost forever. The restaurant around them was still buzzing with excited conversation about the performance they had just witnessed. But Lucy felt like she was standing in the center of a quiet bubble where anything seemed possible. 6 months had passed since that unforgettable night at Rosewood Restaurant, and Lucy could hardly believe how much her life had changed. She was sitting in the green room backstage at Lincoln Center, wearing a beautiful black concert dress and waiting for her cue to walk onto one of the most famous stages in the world. In just a few minutes, she would be performing as a soloist with the New York Philharmonic in front of 3,000 people. The audition that Jonathan Hayes had arranged had been terrifying and wonderful at the same time. Lucy had spent 2 weeks preparing, practicing on the old keyboard in her apartment until her neighbors probably wanted to scream. She had been so nervous walking into that audition room that her hands were shaking. But the moment she started playing, everything else disappeared. The orchestra's music director had been impressed not just with her technical skills, but with her story. "We need musicians who understand what music really means," he had told her after the audition. "Someone who has lived life, who has struggled, who can bring real emotion to their performance. That's what makes the difference between a good musician and a great one." Getting the position with the orchestra had been just the beginning. Word spread quickly in the classical music world about the waitress who had stunned a restaurant full of people with her incredible talent. Suddenly, Lucy was getting calls from record labels, concert promoters, and music schools. The first person she had called with the good news was her mother. Lucy would never forget the sound of her mom crying, with joy on the other end of the phone. "I always knew you'd find your way back to music," her mother had said through her tears. "Your father would be so proud." With the money the businessman had given her, plus her first payments from the orchestra, Lucy had been able to catch up on all her bills and even send her mother enough money to make some much-needed repairs to the house. For the first time in 3 years, she wasn't living paycheck to paycheck, constantly worried about making ends meet. But the money wasn't even the most important part. The most important part was that she was making music again, really making music, the way she had always dreamed of doing. Every day felt like a gift, a chance to do work that filled her soul instead of just paying her bills. The businessman had surprised her by staying in touch. His name was David, and it turned out that underneath all that arrogance was someone who was capable of genuine remorse and change. He had grown up poor, he told her, and sometimes success had made him forget what it felt like to struggle. Watching her play that night had reminded him of something important about treating people with respect. David had become one of her biggest supporters, attending every performance and even helping to fund a music scholarship program that Lucy had started for students who couldn't afford lessons. "You taught me something valuable that night," he had told her. "You taught me that everyone has a story and everyone deserves to be treated with dignity." The scholarship program had become one of Lucy's favorite projects. Every week she taught piano lessons to kids from low-income families, Kids who reminded her of herself at that age, when music was the most important thing in the world. Seeing their faces light up when they mastered a difficult piece was almost as rewarding as performing on stage herself. Professor Williams had been overjoyed when Lucy reached out to reconnect. They had met for coffee, and Lucy had been amazed to discover that her old teacher had kept track of her all these years, always hoping that someday she would find her way back to music. "I never stopped believing in you," Professor Williams had said. "Talent like yours doesn't just disappear." The professor had helped Lucy work on some of the technical aspects of her playing that had gotten a bit rusty during her years away from serious practice. But mostly she had helped Lucy rebuild her confidence as a performer. "You're not the same person you were when you left school," she had observed. "You've been through real hardship now, and that shows in your playing. Your music has more depth, more emotion than it did before." Tonight's performance was particularly special because it was being recorded for a live album. Lucy's first recording contract had come about almost by accident, when a record producer happened to be in the audience at one of her early performances with the orchestra. Now classical music fans around the world would be able to hear her play. The piece she was performing tonight was the same Chopin ballade that she had played that night at the restaurant. It seemed fitting somehow, like she was coming full circle. But this time, instead of playing for a room full of surprise diners, she was playing for an audience that had come specifically to hear her music doc as she waited backstage, Lucy thought. About all the people who had helped make this moment possible. Jonathan Hayes had become not just a supporter but a friend, and his positive reviews of her performances had helped establish her reputation in the classical music world. The restaurant manager at Rosewood had been so proud of her success that he had framed the newspaper article about her comeback and hung it in the restaurant's entrance. Even some of her old co-workers from the restaurant had come to her performances. They told her they always knew there was something special about her, though Lucy suspected they were being kind. It didn't matter anyway. What mattered was that they were happy for her success. Lucy had learned something important over the past 6 months. Success wasn't just about achieving your dreams. It was about remembering the people who helped you along the way and using your good fortune to help others. She made sure to hire former restaurant workers as assistants when she could, and she always made time to talk to young musicians who were struggling to make it in the competitive classical music world. The stage manager appeared at her dressing room door. "5 minutes, Miss Lucy," he said with a smile. "Are you ready?" Lucy took a deep breath and nodded. She was as ready as she would ever be. As she walked toward the stage entrance, she could hear the orchestra tuning their instruments and the murmur of the audience settling into their seats. Just before she stepped onto the stage, Lucy paused for a moment and thought about that night 6 months ago, when she had been terrified to sit down at a piano in front of a room full of strangers. She thought about how close she had come to spending the rest of her life hiding from who she really was, pretending that music didn't matter to her anymore. Sometimes life puts you in impossible situations that feel like they're designed to break you down. But sometimes, if you're brave enough to face those situations head-on, they turn out to be exactly what you needed to find your way back to yourself. As Lucy walked onto the stage and saw the beautiful concert grand piano waiting for her under the bright lights, she felt the same magical feeling she had experienced that night at the restaurant. The fear was still there, but it was mixed with excitement and joy and a deep sense of gratitude for the unexpected turns that life can take. The audience applauded as she took her place at the piano, but Lucy barely heard them. She was already lost in the music, already thinking about the story she was about to tell through her fingers and the keys. This was where she belonged. This was who she was meant to be, and no amount of struggle or hardship could ever take that away from her again. She placed her hands on the keys, took one final deep breath, and began to play. The music that flowed from the piano that night was more beautiful than anything she had ever created before, because it came from someone who had learned that dreams delayed are not always dreams denied. Sometimes they're just dreams that needed time to grow into something even more wonderful than you had originally imagined. And in the audience, David sat in the front row with tears in his eyes, grateful for the lesson a brave waitress had taught. him about looking beyond the surface to see the extraordinary potential that exists in every human being.